So Dr. Amanda Vincent is a research scholar and a practical frontline conservationist. She is a professor in the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Amanda is also co-founder and director of Project Seahorse, a marine conservation team committed to conservation and sustainable use of the world's shallow coastal marine ecosystems. She is proud of making measurable differences for seahorses, their ecosystems, and people who depend on the ocean. Amanda and her Project Seahorse team focuses on saving seahorses and the wildlife trade, primarily by establishing protected areas, limiting problem fisheries, and cutting down on illegal trade. They are particularly committed to ending bottom trawling, a form of annihilation fishing where all life is removed, as I'm sure Amanda will be going into here. And then among other international roles, Amanda chairs the IUCN SSC Marine Conservation Committee and the IUCN SSC Seahorse, Pipefish, and Sea Dragon Specialist Group. And she is an expert advisor to the United Nations Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Quite a record there. Amanda is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the country's top academic accolade. And among other accolades, she was also honored with the first Whitley Award, a Rolex Award for Enterprise, a Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation, and a Canada Research Chair. And of course, her most recent accolade is the 2021 winner of the Indianapolis Prize, the world's top award for animal conservation. And this has never been given to an ocean advocate before, so it's a pretty tremendous deal. So without further ado, congratulations and welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Pax. And really nice to see people in person. I think this is our first seminar back together. So it's a great chance to actually connect with people here and also, of course, colleagues and friends who are on Zoom. And I've got to remember where I have to stand to be on the camera. So somewhere there-ish, got it. So we're doing a hybrid version, which is even more challenging than either one together, and we'll see how it works. My brief was to give my Indianapolis Prize lecture. So I've just been in Indianapolis, picking up this glorious global award and doing an awful lot of lectures to the universities and to colleges and public panels and meeting children and just generally having a thoroughly wonderful time. And I used a particular lecture for most of the long presentations there, and Catherine asked if I would give it to you here. So this is in a very particular context-based lecture, and we will go ahead and give you other talks this year, I'm sure, if we're invited. So let me start with this story of saving seahorses to save the seas. I suspect, like many of you in this room, I have always been driven by a tremendous passion to make a difference. I really want to ensure that all of our work is relevant, that we're actually ensuring that the oceans are in better shape, that species and species-independent people are faring better as a result of our work. So this is really a story of how we've gone about trying to make a difference in the world. And it will appear as a solo voyage with me at the helm, but please know that there are a vast number of other people involved in this. Students and volunteers and interns and postdocs and collaborators and field staff and donors and supporters and partners. And it's just been a huge enterprise, actually, to make progress on this. The story is not linear, although it'll sound linear in this particular lecture, but it's actually been full of twists and turns. So I liken it a little bit like sailing into a headwind. If you've ever tried to sail, you know that going straight into a headwind doesn't get you anywhere. So you've got to tack to port, to starboard, to left, to right, to get to your eventual destination. And conservation is all about tacking your way to an end point. We've done rather a lot of effective work in Project Seahorse, and I think one of the reasons we've been effective is by keeping a very strong understanding of the difference between outputs, outcomes, and impacts. So outputs are those things we can control. We can write a paper, we can give a presentation, we can teach a class, we can hold a symposium, we can control all that. But what does it actually achieve? And the answer to that comes by ensuring that those outputs lead to outcomes. And outcomes are when other people adopt our work, engage with our ideas, represent our suggestions in their own initiatives. So for example, in conservation, we might write a policy brief that suggests a particular management option, but it becomes an outcome when that management option is actually adopted. Or we might propose a new protected area, but it only becomes an outcome when that protected area is gazetted and implemented. Or we might suggest that there needs to be a trade management policy, but it really only becomes an outcome when there is indeed some sort of restriction on trade. So we've always kept our eye very firmly on outcomes rather than being satisfied with outputs. And most importantly, we then have a constant effort and aim of achieving impacts. So do we actually have more fish in the ocean? Do we actually have better livelihoods for people? Do we actually have healthier habitats? Now, those things come about vanishingly rarely. It is extremely unusual to actually get impacts, but we can certainly hold ourselves accountable for outcomes. We can hold ourselves accountable for the effective application of our outputs and our works and our ideas to societal change. And I challenge each of you to remember that producing a paper is useless if it just dies on the journal pages. The question is what we do with it and how we actually take it forward. And Project Seahorse is very committed to a constant feedback loop of research and management. So we have a management challenge, we do some research to support it, and that leads to a management improvement or a management question that guides our research going forward. So I'm going to whiz through a bit of a story now on my life with ocean conservation. So it all started innocently enough when during my PhD, I was interested in understanding the evolution of sex differences, understanding why in seahorses the male got pregnant, and more to the point, given that males do get pregnant in seahorses, then what that meant for the evolution of sex differences. Generally speaking, males are larger, more vocal, more conspicuous, more colorful because they're engaged in active competition for mates. That's because the female limits the rate of reproduction in so many species. But if the male got pregnant and limited the rate of reproduction, what would that mean for actually the differences between the two sexes? Would we get females that are more vocal, more colorful, more conspicuous, and so on? Short answer is no, and that's largely to do with monogamy, but that's not the story for today. The story for today is my devotion to seahorses and where it led. So I was studying seahorses in mangroves, and I was studying seahorses in coral reefs. These species, by the way, that you see on the screen right now are only the size of your baby fingernail as adults. And I was studying seahorses in seagrasses, which by the way are my favorite habitat, and becoming quite good at understanding their life history, their ecology, their behavior, and so on. And into this idyllic existence, I suppose, I think back on with fondness on the times when I could spend 6 hours, 9 hours for months on end just watching animals underwater, very zen. Into this idyllic existence came the realization that there was a huge fishing pressure on these guys. So I was traveling in Berlin when an electronic billboard scrolled across that said in German, I translate literally, that seahorses are the most valuable exports from the Philippines to help men with weak tails. And that obviously fascinated me. So I was able to obtain funding to go and look into this. And what we found was a massive exploitation of seahorses. Now I'm going to cut to the end of the story and tell you that the biggest single pressure on seahorses is bottom trawling, is indiscriminate, non-selective fishing. Bottom trawling, seine nets, and a number of other non-selective gears. And that we will talk about at length. So for example, a relatively careful bottom trawl fishery, relatively clean, will catch 15% target and 85% non-target. Just think about that for a moment. Bottom trawl fisheries that are considered well managed might be a 1:6 ratio. There are many bottom trawl fisheries that are 1:33 ratio. And as I'll tell you, it's got considerably worse than that recently. Now, this is a great concern, this bottom trawl fisheries, but it's taken us a while to understand its full pressure. And we actually started by working on small scale fisheries in the Philippines and elsewhere. Small scale fishers go out to catch anything they can in many areas now, simply because of the serial depletion of the fisheries resources. What that means is that they used to catch one species, it was depleted so badly, they moved to another species that again was so overfished, they moved to a third species and so on. And one indication of just how problematic some of these fisheries have begun is that people in some areas are focusing on seahorses, which are hardly the most straightforward fishery. And the center of small-scale fisheries for seahorses is off the island of Bohol in the central Philippines. So we then started working in that area in community-based conservation, which has real merits, but is very slow and very small against the scale of the challenge that we face with ocean conservation these days. Now, in the central Philippines, we were working on a double barrier reef called Danajon Bank, which is about 135 kilometers long. 2 coral reef banks that run parallel to each other. Quite extraordinary, very, very rare. And this is an area where the center of evolution of biodiversity is found. A lot of marine radiation happened there, but it's also where you have desperate human need. This is kind of common sight in the Philippines, this island, which the mangroves around it have no land under them. All the land, well, coral atoll really, all of the atoll is covered with very tightly packed community dwellings with, in many cases, no running water, no electricity, no roads, but good public schooling, or at least public schooling. The Philippines values its education. But there's almost no way to earn a living here in meaningful sense apart from the ocean. And so ocean dependency is enormous, and overfishing is a significant issue here with very serious implications for the communities. So we started trying to figure out what we were going to do here to reconcile fisheries and conservation. And that, friends, I would suggest is always our challenge. How do we reconcile fisheries with long-term conservation of species, spaces, culture, livelihoods, and so on? And we consulted with a number of different experts, starting with the community itself. What would they advise we should try to do to deal with the fact that there was significant overfishing in this area and that seahorse populations were plummeting? So this started as a seahorse conservation initiative. What should we do? We asked national experts, we asked international experts, we asked conservation colleagues, we asked everybody we could think of. How do we reconcile fisheries with conservation? And don't give us idealized plans that are not implementable. We need to have functional ways forward for this. And all the guidance was that we needed marine protected areas. Everybody agreed that that was probably the best way forward, spatial management. And with that guidance in mind, we worked with the communities on marine protected areas. And the first MPA that was proposed to us by the village was 50 meters by 50 meters. And that clearly wasn't going to be a great deal, but we praised and applauded and encouraged and supported, and that MPA grew. Now I need to deal with the word we here. The frontline people in all of our field projects have always been in-country nationals. And so in this case, I'm talking about a team of Filipino biologists married to a team of Filipino social workers to try to make progress in the communities. If you marry biologists with social workers, then you deal with the fisheries, or the conservation and the fisheries, which is absolutely vital. So every time you hear we, that meant me as a sort of background person and other Westerners supporting and assisting Filipino colleagues to work directly with the communities. And of course, even Filipino colleagues can be very removed from a remote fishing village. So we also had local village staff. And we were able to implement 35 no fishing zones in the end in this region. That one that was 50 meters by 50 meters grew to 1 kilometer by 500 meters and keeps growing, doubling again last year. So we were able to initiate a lot of marine protected areas that, yes, did have impacts. We actually had more fish in the ocean, and there's a whole story there. But while we were doing that, we were simultaneously also working on trying to understand this trade in seahorses globally. And Hong Kong is the entrepot for much wildlife trade. In other words, that's where a lot of countries feed their specimens into, their supplies into, and where they radiate out to markets. We again worked with Hong Kong Chinese colleagues, and you can see Samuel in this picture, who is sitting beside a pile of seahorses, dried seahorses. I've worked on seahorses for about, 25, 30 years, and I have never seen this many seahorses live cumulatively in all those years. So the trade turned out to be enormous. But again, tackling this in a collegiate fashion, Samuel soon made very good ties with the traditional Chinese medicine community there. The Chinese Medicine Merchants Association of Hong Kong remains a major collaborator with us, and we're able to access their warehouses, their trade records, and document what's going on and understand supplies and demands. And they've adopted voluntary codes of conduct long before there was any mandate legally, and have been tremendous allies. So one thing I'd say to students is you're going to get farther if you never promise and you never impose, and if you regard everybody as a potential ally, because you can always find connections with every single person. There is some connection that will enhance conservation. So through this collaboration with the Chinese Medicine Merchants Association and other great allies at the University of Hong Kong and WWF Hong Kong and so on, we were able to understand the scale of this trade. And it soon became apparent that we were dealing with tens of millions of seahorses, 25 million animals maybe, among about 80 countries. So it was a very, very big challenge. And the work we'd been doing in the communities, which was the marine protected areas, I should have mentioned that was for all marine species, the marine protected areas and the alliance building for small scale fishers and understanding women's fisheries and scholarships for the kids of seahorse fishers and so on. All of that was splendid, but it was localized and didn't begin to tackle this huge challenge that we were confronted with for the seahorses. So from that, we decided we would have to reach out much more globally. You know, community by community is going to be valuable, but is very, very painstaking. And there's a lot more to be said about that I won't go into right now. So what you're going to look for in conservation always is kind of a marriage of bottom up and top down, but probably most importantly, working at the middle level, and more on that. So as we're trying to confront this massive trade, we also begin to realize the implications of this trade for the seahorses on a global scale. And we conducted the first red list assessments for marine fishes in a workshop with other colleagues, and realized that many of the seahorses were having catastrophic declines in their populations, such that now about a third of them are classified as threatened, a third are so data deficient that we can't even figure it out, and another third are probably in okay shape. There are about 46 species. So we're looking at a lot of species in trouble and a lot that are data deficient and may or may not be in trouble. So we embarked on working with CITES. Now, CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, Wild Fauna and Flora. So CITES, and that is a UN convention that embraces 182 countries plus the European Union. So it's a very, very substantial global convention. It lists animals or plants, or I guess, I don't think fungi yet, but animals and plants on three appendices. Appendix 1 is where trade is essentially banned. International global trade is essentially banned in those taxa. Appendix 2 is where the exports are limited to sustainable levels that do not damage wild populations, and where they must be legally sourced. And I'd suggest that really all taxa ought to be on a list where exports do not damage wild populations and where they're legally sourced, but this is still a matter of considerable debate as to which species should go on these lists. And at the time we got involved, it was an enormous, enormous debate over whether marine fishes could be brought under CITES. So CITES deals with everything from cactuses and parrots to elephants, but there was considerable controversy about including marine fishes. The argument was that marine fishes are economic commodities best left to the FAO to manage, and that they really shouldn't be brought under a trade convention which has a conservation priority to it. So there had been repeated rejections of proposals to list sharks or to list a great number of other marine fishes. And realistically, we were going to have a very big challenge on our hands. So at that time, because of the trade work we'd been documenting, non-governmental organizations got involved, and a few of them proposed that we should actually put seahorses on Appendix 2. And to everybody's surprise, I rejected this idea at the time and said that we need to do a lot more consultation and a lot more development of ideas. It's all very well to say that countries have to restrict their exports to sustainable levels, but what does that really mean? You know, the world is papered with agreements that are not implemented, and there's no point just adding to that pile. So rather than plunge in with a notional restriction, it was important that we, first of all, have a plan, and secondly, that we get buy-in. So I chaired a CITES committee, really a very rare instance where species that were not listed were handled by CITES. And we brought in countries that were most likely to oppose the marine fish listings of seahorses and other species, Japan and Indonesia and Korea and so on. We talked at length, we improved our taxonomy, we developed ways that we could actually suggest trade regulations that were meaningful. We had a whole lot of tools now available. And over those 2 years, it became clear that it would be really important actually to bring the seahorses under CITES. So by now we developed a lot of allegiances, a lot of collaborations to deal with this. And we had support from NGOs, from the IUCN, which is an intergovernmental organization, from the US, from even the FAO saw what we were about. And it became possible that we might get an agreement on the seahorses. So with all those allies and many more, we proceeded to a CITES meeting in Chile, in actually Santiago. This is the maritime port for Santiago, where the marine fishes were again coming up for debate. And these meetings at that time involved 169 countries and are huge deals with thousands of people involved representing their countries and other interests. So in this meeting, marine fishes were a very prominent issue. There were proposals to list the basking shark and the whale shark, proposals to list the humphead wrasse, which is a huge reef fish, and proposals to list the Patagonian toothfish or Chilean sea bass. The two shark proposals were defeated. And by defeated, I need to tell you that you need 2/3 majority. You need 2/3 majority for these listings, not a simple 50+1, as in all other processes that we encounter. You need 2/3 majority. So the sharks got a majority, but they didn't get the 2/3 majority, so they went down to defeat. The humphead wrasse was just unfamiliar to people. It just wasn't on the radar, so that went down to defeat. And the Patagonian toothfish or Chilean sea bass got so controversial and so heated that Australia actually pulled the proposal rather than create global geopolitical bonfire. So it was down to the seahorses. And it was really quite extraordinary to be in that room. About 1,000 people on this so-called committee. And when you're speaking, your face comes up 4 stories high. And there had been much debate for years about marine fishes and quite a lot of debate about the seahorses. So with Japan most adamantly objecting and many of Japan's allies and collaborating nations supporting that objection. So after debate, the chair of this 1,000-person committee turned to the USA, which had generously proposed the listing of seahorses, and invited them to sum up and conclude the debate. The US said that they would like to defer to the IUCN, which in this context was me. The chair said, no, US, get on and do it. The US said, we'd like really to have the IUCN do it. The chair said, no, you got to do it. And the US said, please, just let the IUCN do it. And he said, okay, get on with it, but make it quick. So I had about 90 seconds to conclude the entire debate that was raging for rather a long time. One point there, by the way, nobody refuses a reasonable request 3 times. Just keep that in mind. It's something really valuable for you to know at this stage in your career for the students. So I was given 90 seconds to sum up, benefited enormously from having a wizard colleague beside me, Sarah Fowler, who leads the shark work in CITES. And we managed to come out with kind of one punchy riposte for each attack point that had been made. Whereupon the vote was called. And in UN meetings, you wave your placard as a country to indicate your vote. So it looked like we might just have got the 2/3 we needed. And at that point, the chair decided he couldn't let this happen without a proper analysis of that vote. So he called for a roll call vote, which means every country had to declare its position, whereupon Japan asked for a secret ballot, whereupon the whole thing descended into procedural wrangling, and eventually a roll call vote was uttered. So we heard what each country's perspective was, and to everybody's enormous surprise, we got 3/4 of the vote in favor of listing seahorse and CITES. And that is momentous. It represented the first time that this UN agreement had ever decided to restrict the global trade in any marine fish. And in fact, the first time that it happened under any procedure, agreement, or entente. So it was really momentous. And it basically marks a turning point where marine fishes are considered more like wildlife, as they should be, and less like simple economic commodities. So that was quite extraordinary. We had the seahorse listing. And then emboldened by that, the people who were proposing the whale shark and the basking shark brought their proposals back to the floor in the plenary session at CITES. And no longer could CITES say, we don't deal with marine fishes of commercial importance, because they clearly did. So the basking shark and whale shark also came under global export restrictions. So never underestimate the power of a cute fish. These cute fishes have often opened doors like this in lots of ways at local, national, and global levels that I won't go into today. If you can find the right species, you can wave an awful lot of flags behind it. So we now had restrictions on the export of seahorses and other marine species. We needed to go forward with that. Again, we got an outcome now, but we got to move from an output to an outcome and on to an impact. What do you do with these paper agreements? And so this is where some of the homework we've done in preparing draft management protocols and approaches really came into its own. And we gave an awful lot of support to countries in a variety of ways. At some point in this process, it became obvious that countries were still struggling to meet their obligations, which was to ensure that the export trade did not damage wild populations and ensure that they were being legally sourced and actually that the live specimens were being humanely traded. So CITES is unusual in having a process that allows countries to challenge each other on whether they're meeting their obligations or not. So countries were asked for particular species to indicate whether their exports were sustainable or not and how they were making that finding. This proved extremely difficult for many countries. And some countries in particular stumbled over this obligation. So Vietnam, for example, was not able to explain how it was justifying its exports. Thailand likewise. And CITES felt they should be given recommendations for improvement. At that point, I think I was given about half an hour to come up with recommendations as to what these countries should do to improve their reliability of their global export trade. It's a fairly frightening moment when you realize that your very partial knowledge, because that's all we all have is partial knowledge, is going to guide national government policy. So we fall back on first principles. For example, these countries had signed up to the Aichi targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So therefore, they were actually obliged to ensure that they were protecting 10% of their ocean by 2020. Okay, let's ensure that includes seahorse habitats. Many of these countries, and particularly Vietnam and Thailand, had trawl restrictions in their inshore waters that they were not implementing. Okay, let's improve implementation of those, and so on. So we chose to push at an open door, let's say, for this work, particularly as it was the first marine fishes through this review of significant trade. And the challenges that we posed to countries with the recommendations were not overly onerous, but still proved very challenging for the countries. So Vietnam, for example, didn't really manage to make much progress before the deadline. And as a consequence, the first ever global export ban on marine fish species came down for Vietnam. CITES precluded them exporting those species anymore. Well, more accurately, it precluded other countries from importing them. So that was a challenge for Vietnam. It didn't exactly break the economy of Vietnam, but the optics weren't good, that it couldn't manage to sort out its obligations. And we've since worked very closely with Vietnam on this challenge. And Vietnam has managed to get approval to reopen that trade and has implemented a number of other measures to try to do a better job of meeting its obligations. And we continue to work closely with Vietnam on this challenge. Thailand also had significant difficulty meeting its obligations and probably could have taken it more seriously. After realizing for some time that this was still a big challenge, and this is all tangled up with the European Union yellow flagging and red flagging protocols, Thailand decided off its own bat that it would ban its exports of seahorses for a while it figured things out. Now, to be clear, we're not seeking bans on trade at all. We're seeking sustainable trade. And that becomes an issue again in a moment. So everything we did, I hope I've indicated, was setting precedent for marine fishes. The listing, the guidelines and recommendations, the frameworks for how countries could make decisions, the export, the review of significant trade that actually looked into and investigated their approaches, the bans. This is all setting precedent. And this became rather important because in the background through all this, CITES had been adding more marine fishes. So we had the seahorses. We also had the basking shark and whale shark, but during this process, over these years, the sawfish were added, the white shark was added, the humphead wrasse was added, the hammerhead, the oceanic white-tip manta rays, devil rays. Now there's a clarion angelfish from Mexico, and so it goes. European eels. So now CITES is actually dealing with a lot of marine fish issues, and it has to get it right. And CITES is so far from perfect, but multilateral environmental agreements are super useful tools for mobilizing national initiatives. And it has definitely opened the door for us to work with a lot of countries in bilateral basis to support their challenges. Now, CITES hasn't solved everything, and two of the things it hasn't solved are really, really significant. One of them is the illegal trade. So because managing exports at sustainable levels is a bit of a challenge for countries, a number of them have just chosen to close down the exports of seahorses rather than meet their obligations under CITES. It's easier just to pretend you're not exporting them than to actually figure out how to export sustainably. And now, in fact, through Hong Kong, which, as I mentioned, is the major entrepot, about 95% of the trade through Hong Kong is sourced from countries that should not be exporting seahorses, according to their declarations. And we know this because of our relationship with the Chinese medicine traders in Hong Kong, who still allow us access to their warehouses and their data. Now, those importers didn't even realize there were these export restrictions from these countries because the communications problems in CITES are pretty significant. So that's a place to start, right? Let's improve communications on where the bans are. And we're working very hard with CITES to try to ensure that they pay more attention to the illegal trade aspects, which is not one of the strengths, particularly when it comes to marine fishes. They do okay on monitoring illegal killing of elephants and things like that, but not much yet on marine fishes. Now, the other big nightmare on this, well, I was going to thank her at the end, but I have to pause now to say, when I say we, and I'm talking about CITES work, Sarah Foster leads most of this, okay? So, I want to thank her at the end, but I just want to make sure you know that the we is Sarah Foster leading this. And then the other really important point is that CITES is challenged to deal with sourcing of specimens. And this is, so when CITES restricts exports, it's up to the countries to figure out what to do about that. And CITES does not usually involve itself in the fisheries management or the wildlife management. And this is a very big issue because the monster through all this is bottom trawling. So I mentioned that about 95% of, or that the huge proportion is about 95% of seahorses going to the dried trade. They're also traded live for the aquarium fish. and for curios and souvenirs dried as well. But most of it goes to traditional Chinese medicine. I think I skipped over that point, rather important omission. So you have this massive trawling pressure that we really need to pay attention to for seahorses and all other marine life. I would really argue that the single most important thing we can tackle in a proximate way is bottom trawling. We all know that bottom trawling, as I mentioned, catches a lot of unintentional specimens, a lot of bycatch. Well, I'm not even going to call it bycatch, a lot of stuff it didn't mean to catch. What I want to emphasize is now many trawl fisheries only are going out to sea without targets. They're going out to sea to catch anything they can, any species, any way, anyhow, and it's brought back as an indiscriminate mess. What can be sold individually will probably be taken off at the port and actually marketed in some way, but the vast majority of the catch ends up like this. This is in Tuticorin in Tamil Nadu in southern India, where one of our PhD students, Tanvi Vajanathan, has been working. And it's just piles of undifferentiated debris, marine life, marine species, fish, invertebrates, really important parts of our ocean ecosystem, treated like so much dirt. And if anybody says the phrase trash fish to me, I'm going to go nuts, because trash fish includes a phenomenal number of spectacularly important and wonderful species, including our seahorses. So you end up with these undifferentiated piles. These are then sold for animal feed, chicken feed, aquaculture feed, other animal feed for pennies a kilogram, pennies a kilogram. So these trawlers rape the ocean bottom for pennies a kilogram. And they only survive, of course, because of subsidies, either in the form of fuel subsidies or other direct subsidies, or in the form of enslaved labor or indentured labor. I'm going to give you a 1-minute video that we've created to try to capture the essence of this and hope it enrages you as much as it does me. It is appalling how bottom trawl fishing is destroying our seas. All over the world, bottom trawlers are clear-cutting our ocean floor and dragging up most marine life along the way. Boats drop wide-mouthed nets with heavy weights that gouge and scrape, mowing down seagrasses and corals. These nets catch thousands of species, from seahorses to sharks, including many juvenile fish that should grow into valuable human food. The waste of life is atrocious, and the cost is dreadful. Landed catch is now often sold unsorted for mere pennies as feed for farmed fish or other animals. Bottom trawling is unprofitable and only continues because our governments give them our money to keep them fishing. It gets worse. Some trawlers even rely on crews of slaves or other forced labor. Bottom trawling is annihilation fishing. It needs to stop. That this is annihilation fishing, a phrase that we've coined. You are gouging up every single thing you can, and you are flattening the bottom of the ocean. You are reducing the ocean floor to debris and waste. And then you have studies that say, oh, trawling doesn't do that much damage. Well, you know what? If you've already trawled an area 25 times, you go over it the 26th time, it doesn't look that different. But bottom trawling is an abomination, and it has to stop. So I want you to engage me in a thought exercise for a moment. Can you all shut your eyes for a second? Yes, everybody on Zoom too. Can you shut your eyes for a minute, please? And can you picture your favorite hillside, your favorite park, your favorite mountain, whatever it is? And I want you to picture 2 helicopters dropping a big razor wire between them, weighted, heavy, plowing into the ground. And I want you to imagine them pulling that razor wire for hundreds of meters to kilometers, clear cutting everything in the path, every tree, every bush, every blade of grass, and removing every bat, bear, bug, bee, butterfly, beaver, the whole lot. And I want you to imagine then at the end that everything they've scooped up in this ginormous net they're towing is now reduced to chicken feed, aquaculture feed, animal feed, and sold for pennies a kilogram. And I want you to tell me how long we would tolerate that on land. You can open your eyes. Just think about that for a minute. And yet we do that to the ocean all the time. Hundreds of thousands of trawlers are raking the bottom of the ocean on a daily basis, doing just that. And the biggest single problem we have is most people have never even heard of bottom trawling. And this is where the effort has to be applied. We know what to do. Get bottom trawling, start by getting bottom trawling out of shallow coastal areas, get it out of all the marine protected areas. Yes, we bottom trawl in marine protected areas around the world. Get rid of the subsidies, and lots of people working well on that, and make sure we don't expand the bottom trawling into other areas with the end goal of ending bottom trawling. And this is where Project Seahorse will be putting its main focus for the next 5 to 10 years. And then once we've sorted that out, we'll move on to the next thing. We don't do this at all alone, of course, and we have all sorts of collaborators and partners. We've done a lot of community science with iSeahorse, and that just speaks to our capacity to engage a lot of people in caring about these funky little fishes that represent the stuff at the bottom of the net. And I just want you to keep in mind, here's the index of trawl pressure for the world. Most bottom trawlers only catch 1 to 2 seahorses per boat per night. Think about that for a minute. 1 or 2 seahorses per boat per night. And yet countries like Vietnam and Thailand export 5 million seahorses a year. Just think about the trawl pressure that's inherent in that. Most of them source from bottom trawls. So this has to stop, and we're going to need a massive assault on this unsustainable form of fishing. And that's where you guys all come in, particularly the students. Every single person needs to be talking about bottom trawling to anybody who will listen. I would say that a lot of the conservationists I talk to have never heard of bottom trawling. If they're land-based, they haven't a clue. So we need to talk to them. A lot of ocean people still think that plastics are the biggest single issue. Yeah, plastics matter for sure, but there is nothing compared to this scourge of bottom trawling. And we've got to get serious about that. So talk it up, please. Talk it up in every way you can. And any of our trade regulations, our export trade regulations, are not going to actually work as long as these animals are still being caught in the wild. I've got a few more slides. So as we go into this voyage, I want to encourage the students particularly to take 3 things with them: onions, rocks, and a backpack. Onions. Take a cross section of an onion and look at it, and you'll see the concentric rings. And this, my friends, represents the way we have to look at conservation problems. Project Seahorse has put seahorses at the center of our scheme, but you can put anything you like at the center of the scheme. However, for seahorses to do well, we have to look after their habitats and ecosystems, hence the work on protected areas. For those to do well, we have to pay attention to the fishers, the trawlers, the dredgers, the miners, the dumpers, the people who affect our ocean, the coastal developers. And for us to work well with them, we have to ensure their families have opportunities, that they have livelihood choices, that there's law and order, that there's good governance. And that's true at the regional scale, the national scale, and then increasingly at the global scale. Outside all this, we have the human behavior of greed and altruism, self-discipline and self-indulgence. And all these rings bear down on whatever we put at the center of our universe. So it's vital, it's really vital that we keep in mind these multi-layered approach to conservation. Project Seahorse has had wins at all these layers. I also want you to remember about rocks, pebbles, and sands. So if I hold out a big jar and I say, Elsa, can you come and fill the jar with rocks? And Elsa does so, we'd agree it's full. But no, I turn to Joanna and say, can you pour in the pebbles? And they run through between the rocks. I turn to Marta and say, can you put the sand in? And she pours it down. And the jar is really full now. Well, there's still room for something else. So if I turn to Ema and say, pour the beer in, right? So the point of this is, as we're trying to make decisions about our work, we need to focus on the rocks and put them in place first. The rocks are the critical issues of health and well-being, everybody, but also really paying attention to the things that will make a difference and gain the outcomes and impacts. The pebbles are the small bits of work. The pebbles are little projects you need to do, little enterprises you need to enter into, things that will make a difference. Mentoring your graduate students well, for example, or contributing to society. The sand is all those bits that otherwise appear in your life. So all the emails and all the committee meetings and all the bits and pieces of admin. And the point of this is if you put the sand in first, there will be no room for the pebbles and the rocks in your life. And so as professionals, we have to put the rocks in first and then the pebbles. And if there's room, the sand. And that's my excuse for being slow on emails. And of course, the question is, well, what about the beer? And, you know, I turn to Adam and say, there's always room for beer, no matter how full your life, right? The final thing I want to mention is that we all need a bag of courage. So every single person lives with imposter syndrome. Every single person feels inadequate, hugely inadequate. As Bob Johannes, a wonderful colleague of mine, pointed out, there's no such thing as perfect advice. There's imperfect advice or none at all. There's imperfect guidance or none at all. There's imperfect supervision or none at all. There's imperfect management or none at all. And we too often say we need to know more when we have to accept we're never going to get to perfect management or perfect advice. And we got to plunge forward with imperfect knowledge and imperfect understanding. Always being open and honest about that in a framework of adaptive management, where we engage people in helping to improve the management or the policy or the recommendation and do a better job over time. So as we've sailed, we've taken a very indirect path, although I made it sound linear, and we've achieved a lot along the way. But there's so very much more to do. It was honestly incredibly exciting to get the Indianapolis Prize because it indicated we'd done good work and it gave us a sense of confidence, but it also propels us forward to do yet more to make a difference to the world. And the IOF is a wonderful place in being determined to effect change. But I really want to remind us all the time that graduate students, as you do your work, apply it. You know, my colleagues do that well, but we need to take pride in the fact we apply this. I want to thank my Project Seahorse team who are here, particularly Sarah Foster and Gina Bespear, Lily Stanton, who's listening, and Heather Coldaway, who co-founded it all, because every time I've said I was cheating madly, and it represents, of course, tremendous effort by wonderful colleagues. And I want to thank the IOF for inviting me to give this lecture. It's been really fun to do in person, and I hope the Zoom people didn't suffer too badly. Thanks ever so much.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you well, William.
Thank you. I unfortunately cannot join the in person because I have back-to-back meetings this morning since 6 a.m. But I think the hybrid mode is amazing because it makes it work. Otherwise, I won't be able to listen to your amazing talk. So thanks for the Fish 500 team to make this happen. To make I know it is technically complicated to make it work. I also want to say that Amanda's work and her leadership of the Project Seahorse really give us a very excellent and successful example of how to do impactful science policy engagement. And in the end, the Policy Prize is a very well deserved recognition of your achievement. And I want to just say that our institute is lucky to have you and the Project Seahorse as a part of our community. And I think that one of the question that in general that I want to ask you, Amanda, is that based on all your years of experience, what would you recommend our student if you have like one suggestions of the skill that they need to pick up during the graduate training here or elsewhere if they want to follow your footsteps?
I think the most important thing is to be open to grabbing every new opportunity that comes along and becoming really multifaceted, multi-talented. It's terribly important to understand the human dimension and to actually integrate that into your thinking. But it's also important to become good at that, or at least find colleagues and collaborators who are good at that. Biologists often have this deceptive thought that they can do social science and they can do social work, and actually we're not very good at it. So we need to collaborate on that. I think the other thing, the most important thing I would advise you to do is get involved in active application of your work while you're a graduate student. Research is terribly important, and it's the cornerstone, the backbone of your degrees, but applying that knowledge during your degrees is absolutely vital. I hate to say it, but most of you are already instant experts in your field. And if you're not offering advice and guidance and support, then who is? Because we really, really have to have the application of imperfect knowledge, and just be humble about it. Just be open about it, that there's a lot more I have to learn, but here's my best suggestion right now. Adam Hicks is asking, you know, it's all very well to say we should end bottom trawling, but what about human dependency and human engagement? Where do those go? which is of course a critical question. And that's why we're saying ending, not stopping, because it has to be a phased approach for sure. But Roshni Mangar on our team is looking at this for her master's. We're doing quite a lot of thinking about this. And what becomes quite apparent over time, Tanvi Vaidyanathan worked on this a bit too, is that a huge proportion of the people on bottom trawls in developing countries do not have any actual cultural affinity or heritage or association with the ocean or with fisheries. And they are hired labor, which is equivalent to working on a road or working in a factory. There will, of course, be, a captain or a steersman or somebody who knows about the ocean, but most people are hired labor. The problem is still there, but the problem then becomes similar to that of all other employment. How do you ensure the economy has room for people to have meaningful occupations? And that's serious, but I think it's very interesting that we don't need to worry quite as much as we might have imagined about the cultural ties and the fishing affinity, the coastal relationships. So that work is going to be really important in guiding decision-making. But the reality also is that bottom trawling is terribly bad news for small-scale fishing, for selective fishing, for passive gear. And quite probably, there will be many more occupations available in fisheries were we to get rid of bottom trawling, which actually has very few income earning opportunities against the rape of the ocean that it perpetrates.
Moment to thank you, Amanda, for presenting. It's all really informative, and I loved your personal photography in there. And that's on behalf of all of us students and the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries.